Bueno, buenas tardes, le damos la bienvenida a todos los presentes, a las personas que están por Zoom. Hoy arrancamos con el ciclo 2022 de la Cátedra Naumann. Muchas gracias a nuestros compañeros Díaz y Andrés Bellido, que nos ofrecen siempre este espacio tan agradable. Y nuestros disertantes son del equipo de IFLRY, Amanda y Michel. Ellos van a disertar, y Juan Manuel, que también es local de acá de la provincia de Santa Fe. El tema de hoy va a ser los jóvenes y el liberalismo. Le damos la bienvenida a todos y esperamos que lo disfruten como nosotros los disfrutamos hace una jornada y media. Gracias.
Bueno, también les doy la bienvenida en nombre de la Universidad del SEMA. Mi nombre es Matías Sigritsky, soy Managing Director del Centro Friedman Hayek para el estudio de una sociedad libre, y agradeciéndole también las palabras de Nadia Barroso y de la Institución Naumann, vamos a dar entonces lugar a la presentación de nuestros oradores de esta tarde. Ellos van a hacer sus presentaciones en inglés y, como mencionara Nadia, Juan Manuel va a estar haciendo una traducción no simultánea, luego de algunas oraciones por cada uno de los expositores. Vamos a empezar entonces con el primer expositor, que es Michel Nentwig. Él es el secretario general de IFLRY y está principalmente el responsable de la administración de la organización y del compromiso en la región del Medio Oriente y del norte de África, el Cáucaso y el libre comercio. Tiene experiencia en los campos de las redes liberales, los espacios cívicos y el populismo, y a nivel profesional tiene entrenamiento en la industria financiera y cuenta con estudios de grado en la banca y las finanzas. Michel es de Alemania. Bueno, ya le he pedido en repetidas oportunidades disculpas que no estoy pronunciando muy bien su apellido esta tarde, así que le agradezco mucho por su comprensión. Y vamos ahora entonces a ver la presentación de Disculpa, voy a abrir la presentación correcta. Abrió. Ya. Muy bien. Ok. Bueno. So whenever you want, you can let me know and I can. I'm just trying. Yes.
Okay. Hi everyone. Thank you for having us for this presentation today. Amanda and I, together with Poma and the delegation that we have been traveling through Latin America for the past 10 days, and we have the honor to speak to you today. We agreed on speaking a little bit on liberalism in our countries and Germany and Sweden, and I will specifically focus on the past elections in Germany. I assume that you already had some kind of evaluation of the 2021 federal elections in Germany, but nevertheless I will try to focus a little bit on the role of youth and why youth voted liberal. And for that, please the next slide, I'll start with the campaign of the party in 2013. The two men you can see on the slide is left the FDP chairman, Philipp Rösler, who then later together with Werner Brüder became ministers in the government, or back then at the time were ministers in the government. And Werner Brüder was the top candidate in 2013. And they were not necessarily starting their campaign out of a position of strength. It was already kind of foreseeable in the coalition with the Christian Democrats that there were some weaknesses, and the polls didn't really say that FDP would necessarily succeed in the elections. And to understand what then happened in Germany with the campaign campaign of the party, it's important to understand how the electoral system in Germany works. And if you could please skip to the next slide, then this is a poster they were distributing throughout the country. It says, "Jetzt geht's ins Ganze." Basically means now we are like full force, now we are really putting everything into it. And the banner just below that says Zweitstimme FDP. And this is, could you please, the next slide, is because the electoral system in Germany consists out of two different votes. So everybody who's going to vote has two votes. The first vote is for the district of the respective. We have 299 districts in Germany, and everyone who lives in one of these districts has one vote for the district, so a specific person in the district, and one vote for the party, which means that the person who gets the most votes in each district gets a direct mandate into the parliament, and the rest of the seats, so the other 299, will be distributed depending on the share the party gets for the second vote. So for example, if my party would have gotten 10% in the elections, then they would get through the list mandates a total of 29.9, so 30 seats in the parliament. And since they were so focused on the list mandates, because back then they knew they would not win the districts in Germany, the polls were just decreasing over time. And on the next slide, you can see the polls of the parties, surveys that were just made in between, starting from the elections in 2009 to the elections in 2013. You can see that the FDP, which is the yellow lines, the Liberal Party, started at roughly 15% in 2009 and then decreased over time quite rapidly in the first months of being then in the government back then. And to the elections in 2013, they dropped below the 5% level. And this is what we need in Germany to be even considered as a faction in the parliament. Which means that for the very, very first time in the history of the party, we were kicked out of the parliament. And this was quite obviously a big catastrophe. If you take a look at these 5 lines here, you have the Christian Democrats at the top, then the Social Democrats below that, then the Greens and the Left Party. And when the Federal Republic was founded in Germany, there were only the Christian Democrats, the Social Democrats, and the Liberals. So it was quite a big event in Germany that the FDP, for the first time in history, dropped out of parliament. And if you take a look at the next slide, you will see, I don't know if you are familiar with this diagram. It's basically, it has an economic scale from left to right, so the horizontal axis, and it has a social scale from top to bottom, from authoritarian to libertarian. And this is meant to cluster the parties in the German spectrum, in the German political sphere. You have the FDP on the fairly economic right, quite close to the CSU and CDU, which are the conservative parties, and the AfD, which is the right-wing conservative party. And quite unsurprisingly, the Greens, the Social Democrats, and the lefts, especially in the economic sphere, are on the left side of the Free Democratic Party. So what then happened, again, the party dropped out of parliament in 2013, and from there on, there was a renewal process of the party. They started to redesign the party, and if you go to the next slide, the whole process was basically managed by this man, who is now the Minister of Finance in Germany, Christian Lindner, also chairman of the party. And on the next slide, you see that the colors and the logo, the branding changed quite a lot. There are not only the two yellow and dark blue colors as before, but a little brighter yellow, a little brighter blue, and magenta as a third color in the logo of the party. So it appeared to be a bit more modern than it was before. And in addition to that, and this was actually a big problem in the campaign of 2013 when they dropped out of parliament, that they focused a lot on campaigning against the potential social democratic green coalition, and a lot for tax reduction, a lot for economic policy, but not so much left and right. So that apparently, if you take a look at the results, was not the best strategy. But in the upcoming 4 years, so between 2013 and 2017, there was a big rebranding, and they also went through a whole process of renewal also regarding their policies. And I just took 3 examples on the next slide of well, topics they were targeting in their campaign. First of all, home affairs on the left side, with our party chairman back then, still our party chairman, advocating for more security in Germany. That also kind of resulted of the migration crisis in Germany starting in 2015. And then a big topic was also digitalization. Germany is quite popular for being very far behind when it comes to digitized economy, but also digitized administration. So this was a big topic in the election. And then last but not least, education policy, which is basically saying on the poster itself that like the bags children wear to school are the ones that change the world, and not those who like the people carry to the offices. So there was a quite broad spectrum of political topics they were focusing on. And interestingly, education policy was a topic on the top federal level, although the competence in Germany, or competencies in Germany for education, since it's a federal republic, is on the state level, not the federal level. And if you take then a look at the results of the election of 2017, that was quite pleasant for our party, because from below 5% in 2013, when we dropped out of parliament, we had our now third best result of 10.7% to the federal elections in Germany. And you can see the race between the Christian Democrats and the Social Democrats at the very top, the two lines that were even almost closing up to each other at the beginning of 2017. And then all the other parties, the blue one, the light blue one, is the ultra right-wing conservative party, the AfD Alternative for Deutschland, and then the purple one, the left party, the Greens, the Green and the Greens, and the yellow line, the FDP. So out of this position, after a process of 4 years of renewal, we were then elected back into parliament. We actually went to negotiations to build a coalition back then, which did not happen. That caused us quite some criticism in the media. You will see that in a little bit later in the presentation what that meant for the polls. But we were then again elected back into the parliament. And just recently, as you already know, we had elections in September 2021. And what happened, although the results of the elections were also mainly influenced by the Fridays for Future climate strikes in Europe. On the next slide, we see Greta Thunberg, a Swedish national who started this movement by skipping school on Fridays. I think you are all well aware of the situation. And as a consequence of that, on the next slide you see, this is again the polls of the parties from 2017, so from the recent elections until the 2021 federal elections. And the red line, the red vertical line, is the start, the foundation date, more or less, of the Fridays for Future movement. You can see that the results and the polls for the Green Party skyrocketed from there. Coming from roughly 10%, being quite strong, around 10, 12% at the beginning, at the end of 2017 and the beginning of 2018, the poll results skyrocketed to even 26, 27% in mid-2019. And you see that over the period of time until the past elections in September last year, they were like performing a bit worse than the high time of 2019, but they at least got 14.8% in their federal election result, which was also the best result of the party left. And FDP still, the Liberals, performed 11.5, which was then the second best result in recent years. And I will not talk too much about the other parties. I think you can see, especially in the Christian Democrats and the Social Democrats, towards the end of the campaigns, they even, the Social Democrats overtook the Christian Democrats. This was also the reason why they led the negotiations for the coalitions we are currently in with the Greens, the Social Democrats, and the Liberals. The question is, might be the most interesting for you, why youth or why young people voted in favor of these parties, especially for the FDP, for the Liberals, and for the Green Party. On the next slide, you see the results from compared by age group. And in the youngest age group, 18 to 29, you see that the Green Party was the most popular with over 20%, and the FDP with roughly 20%. And what's even more interesting, that for the first time voters, so everybody who is between 18 and roughly 21, 22 in Germany, 23% each voted for the FDP and the Greens. So almost 50% of the people who voted for the very first time in their lives voted for FDP and Greens. And there were some evaluations after the elections, and on the next slide you see the topics that were mainly raised for both parties, why youth voted for these parties. And for the FDP, you have basically everything that is related to the restrictions of freedoms in the course of the COVID-19 pandemic. Digitization was a big topic, as I said earlier, also the main focus of the campaign. The general demand for less state intervention, also related to the COVID-19 pandemic, but as a more general topic. The presence in social media, my party, I'm from the FDP, member of the FDP, has quite strong social media presence. We have a chairman that is very visible on social media, so this was also a reason why they were elected. Drug legalization, we are not talking about all drugs here, but we are talking about cannabis, which was always a very, very controversial topic in Germany. And then again, the top candidate was very present in the elections. And for the Greens, it was, of course, climate change resulting from the protests for the Fridays for Future movement, but also digitalization, family migration, and as an overlap between FDP and the Greens, drug legalization also as a very overarching topic. And if we then take a look at the next slide, I just highlighted a few other things here. These topics are actually quite closely related to our liberal ideology in Germany, which is said in our party program, saying that we want, or in the campaign program for the elections, that we want to give more freedoms back to the population that were taken away from us during the COVID-19 pandemic. It doesn't surprise that especially youth is voting in favor of these kind of things. If everything that they enjoy in life is taken from them. They couldn't go to school, they couldn't go to university, they couldn't go clubbing, they couldn't go to the gym or play sports. So this was certainly also from a liberal perspective a very important topic in the elections. And then connected to that, demand for the state intervention, and quite obviously, especially for youth, the younger generation, drug legalization was a big topic as well, why they voted for the FDP. So this was a bit more, I think, in time than I intended to say, but this is a broad overview of how it went from the 2013 federal elections, where we got off parliament, then out of strength in 2017, elected back into parliament, and even now in 2021 with a very, very strong result that then at the end made us part of the government, which is very exciting right now. Yeah, if you have any questions, I think either now or after Amanda's presentation, feel free to ask.
Great. Thank you very much, Michel, for that amazing presentation. Les voy a hacer una breve recapitulación para los que están en sus hogares o en sus conexiones a Zoom, escuchando esta intervención. Básicamente lo que hizo Michel fue hacer un relevamiento de la performance electoral del Partido Liberal, concretamente en Alemania, en las elecciones de los años 2013, 2017 y el año pasado, 2021. Viendo inicialmente en el año 2013 una performance en la cual el partido no alcanza a tener un óptimo rendimiento y no alcanza también a tener sobrada representación parlamentaria, cuenta cómo con el liderazgo de Christian Lindner se rediseñan las estrategias de campaña y se hace énfasis en determinados temas que le permiten en 2017 recuperar un caudal electoral muy importante. Y a partir del año 2018, Michel hacía énfasis en el surgimiento del movimiento juvenil de protesta, sobre todo liderado por Greta Thunberg, inicialmente en Suecia y que luego es replicado en todo el mundo. Y ese movimiento galvaniza a la juventud internacional en general y alemana en particular, y hace que surja un nuevo electorado, un nuevo sector del electorado joven, que va a votar por dos partidos que no son los partidos mayoritarios o mainstream del mercado, si se quiere, político alemán, que son la coalición de la Unión Demócrata Cristiana y el Partido Socialdemócrata, la grosa coalición que han gobernado durante la mayor cantidad de años del mandato de Angela Merkel. sino que a partir de este boom del electorado juvenil de 2018 en Alemania, como comentaba Michel en adelante, van a surgir con mucha fuerza electoral tanto el Partido Liberal, el FDP, como el Partido Verde. Michel, por último, analizaba cuáles son los ejes en común de estos dos partidos que representan a este electorado joven. Son la digitalización, la disminución de las restricciones a las libertades individuales impuestas por los estados durante la pandemia, hacía énfasis en las restricciones a la educación, a la libertad de movimiento, actividades recreativas, deportivas, etc. Y por último también a la legalización de los estupefacientes o el consumo recreativo de estupefacientes, de drogas, que también él indicaba es algo muy vinculado a este grupo etario. Digamos que el voto joven hace que el SPD, liderado por Christian Lindner, llegue a ser parte de la actual coalición de gobierno alemana, junto precisamente con el otro partido que tuvo gran auge del voto joven, el Partido Verde, y el Partido Socialdemócrata. Así que bueno, eso ha sido un poco el resumen de la presentación de Michel. Sí, nada.
Castellanos, ¿qué expectativas tienen para los próximos años? ¿Qué expectativas tienen para los próximos años que aumente, en qué porcentaje piensan que va a aumentar ese voto de jóvenes en el IFLRY?
Did everybody understand the question? I suppose, yeah. That's a tough question. I think what again was like a big point during these elections were the COVID-19 restrictions in Germany. Especially for youth, if you advocate them in this environment at the end of 2021, this was certainly a reason why there was such a large share of youth voting for the FDP. And I don't know, I think it's quite hard to predict how sustainable that share of young people is to vote in favor of youth. Because before we've actually seen, specifically in the eastern states of Germany, that for example, the very extreme positions, the left party and the alternative for Germany, AfD, Alternative für Deutschland, the right-wing conservative party, was always quite strong. I think this is something not really surprising that the extremes are just easier to identify with when you are younger. So I don't think that this is a very stable result. I hope it will be, but I'm not very convinced that this will be the case. Again, because I think that the campaign of 2021 just really tackled the issues of youth in Germany.
Thanks.
Bueno, para traducir un poco la respuesta de Michele, básicamente él espera que el gran caudal de votos que tuvo el Partido Liberal en el año 2021 se mantenga, pero reconoce que fue una situación muy excepcional en la cual este partido, también junto con el Partido Verde, reconocieron y le dieron mucha importancia a las cuestiones que eran relevantes para este electorado joven. Sí, Santiago, tenías otra pregunta.
Super interesting exposition, and the question is mainly, since digitalization is one of the main topics that both Green Party, FDP, and Social Democratic parties have in common, and Chancellor Scholz made it such a priority issue in his agenda first. To which point do you believe that the fact that now, well, of course, because of the war, like $100 billion are going to be spent in defense, logically, up to what point do you think that that will actually delay the agenda of digitalization, or up to what point do you believe that that can be countered in some way?
Also a very good question, thank you. What we have seen in Germany right now, from the moment Russia invaded Ukraine, is that every political topic was basically cut out of the agenda in Germany. We're not talking about COVID anymore, which was dominating until then, quite obviously. We were not talking about anything broadly related to the government. Again, the government was formed fairly recently, so then we were under quite some investigation of the other parties of the opposition in that sense. As you said, there was a lot of money from the budget additionally then well, directed to the defense budget. And I feel this is something Germany was struggling with over the past decades, that since we have a quite big, large administration in Germany, things are very likely to be delayed to probably one uncertain point in time. But if you take a look at how it was handled over the past 15, 20 years of how we were, for example, handling the 5G infrastructure in Germany, or even the 4G infrastructure, we were lagging behind basically every country in Europe. And even in the comparison with the OECD countries, we were definitely somewhere in the bottom half, if not the bottom quarter of all OECD countries. So I think there is definitely the will to do so. The conservatives who were in government with the Social Democrats for most of the, well, this century even, did not really make it a priority. I think now it is a priority, but in Germany things usually take quite long until they then actually put it in practice. So I'm not really convinced that we will solve all the digitalization issues in the next 5 to 10 years.
Bien, la pregunta era sobre el tema de la digitalización y si esto es una prioridad del gobierno actual. Y Miquel le contaba que, bueno, estamos en un escenario muy particular, nos habla más de temas generales de gobierno, COVID-19, la situación reciente del gasto del gobierno alemán hacia la defensa, de que en general no ha sido un tema que se le haya dado mucha atención en los últimos 15 o 20 años. Alemania estaba retrasada, entre otros temas, en temas, por ejemplo, de telefonía celular, la red 4G y la red 5G, incluso en comparación con otros países de la OCDE, pero que confía que este sea un tema que se le empieza a dar más importancia en el futuro próximo. Ignacio, tenías levantada la mano. No sé si
sí, quería hacer una pregunta. ¿Lo hago en español o en inglés?
En el que quieras.
Bueno, si lo hago en inglés para que no tengan que esperar el traductor. Good afternoon. I wanted to ask about the energy policy because from what I'm seeing in Germany, there is a largely consent that is against the nuclear energy. From what I'm seeing now with all the things between Ukraine and Russia, the gas that was imported from Russia with the Nord Stream 1 and the now cancelled Nord Stream 2 is now going to be like a hell of a problem, considering that the energy price will rise a lot. And I was wondering what if you have a plan to solve this problem. If you could try maybe trying to go again with nuclear energy or something else, because well, something else, it will be oil and carbon, and considering how ecological of countries Germany, it would be not an option.
Thank you for the question. And I have to say, I'm not officially from the government. I'm just a simple member of the party, and I do a bit of youth politics. But I can still give you my perspective on it, of course. I think from now in retrospect, of course, it's easy to say that, but I believe it was wrong to cut off nuclear energy as quickly as we did. For two reasons. First of all, we then, a couple of years later, decided to also go out of coal. And if you then only have renewable energies and you don't have stable renewable energies in your country, you are dependent on other countries around you. So what happens now, for example, in summer, if it's very hot in Germany, so there is not too much wind, there is solar energy, okay, but there is not too much wind, and also not enough for hydro energy, so not enough just stream in the rivers for hydro energy. We are reliant on nuclear power from either Poland or from Belgium. So we're importing electricity from countries just next to us who have basically produced this energy with technology we would even have in our own country. And this then becomes even more absurd if you take a look at the nuclear power plant, which is directly at the German-Belgian border, which is called Tihange, which was very, very often already labeled as one of the most dangerous power plants in the whole of Europe. but it's still running. And we are using this power plant out of fear of nuclear energy to import it if we don't have enough energy in our own country. And I don't think that there is a way back to nuclear energy. This was actually just recently discussed in Germany, in the government, and our finance minister, our chairman and finance minister said that this is not debatable really. And I also don't think that there would be a majority for that. Just now in the conflict, out of goodwill reasoning, that would certainly could be an option. But with Nord Stream 1 and Nord Stream 2, that are, well, Nord Stream 2, it's not working yet, but we are even discussing to cut off one. And then not having enough infrastructure. This is actually also a big problem in Germany. Enough infrastructure to just distribute the electricity from north to south and south to north. We might have to fight the energy prices just by either subsidizing them or trying somehow through taxes, lowering the taxes, big burden of the population. But I actually don't see that there is any other way right now in Germany to produce energy in a very sustainable way or in a different way than being still reliant on it.
If you say you're importing in from neighbor countries, isn't this a problem like from all Europe in general, especially Germany, because it's the one that gets more, the energy depends more on Russia. I think it was the 40 or the 50% of the energy is produced with Russian gas. But it's in general also a problem. I think the one that are least affected are the Western countries like Spain, that gets their oil by Argel, and France that has pretty much of all their electrical power comes from nuclear power.
No, that is certainly an issue for all of Europe. I think also specifically from a German perspective, it was one of the biggest geopolitical mistakes of the past 20 years, or more than 2011, to be so reliant on Russian energy. The chancellor before Angela Merkel, so I barely experienced him as our chancellor, what is known to have quite tight ties to the Russian government, and this was then also partially the reason why we were so reliant on Russian energy. And I think that this was a mistake. Yes, this is not only Germany's problem, but every other country around, especially France, but also Belgium, or they are producing their own nuclear energy, and they just don't have the dependency. We were just talking about that. Even the Netherlands are now building, I think, 2 nuclear plants in the next 5 to 10 or 15 years. So we are the only country in the center of Europe, the largest country just by population in Europe, that still relies on other countries in Europe. This is not necessarily a problem, it works out, but from the perspective and the reasoning that we cut off nuclear energy out of the possible danger of nuclear energy, but then still importing nuclear energy from neighboring countries, that doesn't really make much sense.
And just I haven't done my presentation yet, but on this topic, that Sweden actually in the elections that I will be talking about in 2018, I was going to bring this up, but since it was a question, our entire energy discussion back then was based on the Germany's result of when they got rid of their nuclear energy, because the whole debate in Sweden was, should we keep our nuclear energy or not? What kind of energy sources do we want to use? Do we want renewable energy? But at the same time, we do not have the capacity to completely go to renewable energy. So the Green and some other, like the Left Party, wanted us to get rid of our nuclear energy. But the whole debate was then regarding like what happened in Germany when they got rid of their nuclear energy, how they got dependent on Russian gas, and we didn't want the same thing to happen in Sweden. But in Sweden, kind of the discussion about Russia pre the war that's happening now was not really centered around worry from being dependent on Russia, actually. Sweden hasn't really had that type of fear in that sense. So it was still a discussion where after the elections, when the Greens got into government, they actually initiated policy that was very anti-nuclear, and we're actually heading in that direction. But now that the war is happening, people are kind of reconsidering what we're going to do, because we know what's going to happen if we get rid of our nuclear energy. We're going to end up in a situation where we are dependent on Russian gas. But we have still not gotten there yet. We still haven't gotten rid of all our nuclear energy, but it is a discussion in Sweden, and it is something that we probably would have done unless Germany went ahead first and had the result that they did, because that was the whole debate in Sweden. So it really, thank you, I'm gonna say, because we could have ended up there, but we didn't, because the debate kind of looked at that example as a bad example in Sweden. And my party, for example, the Liberals, used that as a very, very common example every single time the Greens brought up getting rid of nuclear energy. Every time the left party brought up getting rid of nuclear energy, we said, like, look what happened in Germany. It's not that we're going to go to sustainable energy because we don't have the capacity to go completely sustainable from where we're at now. We're going to have to start importing Russian gas or nuclear energy from other countries, so it will be very, very ineffective. And I've been debating, these parties on this for a very, very long time, and it hasn't been taken seriously until the war happened. Now the debate is looking very, very different, because people are very scared of becoming dependent on Russian gas. So it is a debate that kind of affects the whole EU, because we're dependent on each other when it comes to our energy resources.
I'm sorry, now that you're saying that the debate is...
Ignacio, perdón, te tengo que cortar para cerrar con la traducción y pasar a la exposición de Amanda. Si
Perdón.
Gracias. Bueno, gracias Sonia por el comentario. La traducción de las intervenciones de Michel y Amanda era sobre la pregunta que les había hecho Ignacio de la política energética de sus países. Michel le comentaba que, que Alemania estaba muy interesada en abandonar el carbón y que a partir de una estrategia de diversificación de fuentes energéticas hacia otras que no sean la nuclear, eso hizo que se incremente mucho su dependencia en países vecinos. Dice que incluso en verano se importa energía de países como Polonia y Bélgica, que tienen tecnología que Alemania no tiene para esta producción energética, e incluso importación de energía producida por plantas nucleares, incluso una en la frontera entre Bélgica y Alemania. Y lo que Amanda comentaba era que esta estrategia que le notaba que no es completamente efectiva, hizo que Suecia rechazara adoptar un modelo similar al alemán por verlo fuertemente dependiente de la provisión rusa de energía, y Amanda comentaba que hasta la guerra lamentable reciente existente entre Rusia y Ucrania, este problema no estaba tan en evidencia, pero que ahora sí lo está. Así que habiendo hecho este breve resumen, si les parece podemos pasar a la exposición de Amanda. I'm going to briefly introduce.
Sure.
Bien, voy a hacer una muy breve presentación de Amanda. Amanda es presidente de IFLRY y principalmente responsable por la representación externa y política de la organización, así como su compromiso en África, en tópicos como el cambio climático y en el programa de liderazgo para las mujeres. Amanda también es una funcionaria elegida que sirve como consejera de su ciudad y es una candidata al Parlamento representando al Partido Liberal Sueco para las elecciones de este año en Suecia. Amanda tiene estudios de grado en ciencia política y un máster en leyes y ofrece capacitaciones muy frecuentemente en temas como la juventud, las mujeres y la participación de grupos marginalizados en política. También da capacitaciones en oratoria y en sustentabilidad. Así que ahora sí, le damos la bienvenida a Amanda. Amanda, thank you very much. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much. And I'm very, very excited to give this presentation. I don't know how much you already know about Sweden and Swedish politics, but I'm thinking I'm gonna take it from the basics just because Sweden is a very small country. And so it's not a country not a lot of people know that much about, and there's a lot of myths about Sweden. So I'm actually going to take it from the basics. And as I think you already presented, I am a Swedish politician, so to some sense I can represent the party, so I'm going to talk a little bit from my perspective as a politician in Sweden as well. and have been in politics for almost 10 years now, and I'm an elected official as well in Sweden. So you can take the next slide. I'm going to start with this slide, which is a little political context, because speaking to people here, actually, a lot of people have heard things about Sweden, rather myths about Sweden when it comes to Sweden as a political country and what kind of political stance we are as a country. We hear often that other countries talk about us as the prime example of where socialism works, or the prime example of why socialism doesn't work, and everything in between. But the truth is, I would say, is that Sweden, if you go back in a historical context, there has been policies that have been clearly socialist, and like primarily from the 1960s up into the 1990s. And that is something that happened. But in the current sense of Sweden right now, it's definitely not a socialist country. It is a capitalist country. You can define, socialism in very different senses, narrowly or more broadly, but I would say it's very clear that Sweden is not a socialist country. And the people that use Sweden as an example of a socialist country are just wrong, because Sweden does have a very generous welfare system. It does have higher taxes if you compare it to a lot of other countries, but it is a country that functions through a capitalist system that has done a lot of liberalization on our economic markets during the last 30 years. And if you take kind of the index of economic freedom, that is usually done, worldwide. I don't know if you heard about it, but it's like an index. They rank the economic freedom in different countries. That index ranked in one of the latest rankings, ranked Sweden at 21. And just for context, the US is ranked at 20 in that scale. So Sweden is definitely a country that has done a lot of liberalization on its market, that is definitely not socialist. And that is the context that you need to keep with you when people, ask you about Sweden, what political country Sweden is, or when someone says like socialism works, look at Sweden. Just know that no, it's not a socialist country. Although we do have redistribution through high taxes, it's still a capitalist country which grew economically due to our liberalization of our market economically. So that's just some context, and let's then get into the political parties of it. Sweden is actually a country where the economic scales, or the political scale, is very kind of different from a lot of other places. It is, I would say, a very liberal country. We have here 4 parties that we can actually define as liberal parties, although they are maybe not called so. So we have the Center Party, we have the Liberals, which is my party, we have the Moderates, and we have the Christian Democrats. And all of these parties can actually, in a sense, be defined as liberal parties if you're talking a more broadly context. And I would also say maybe in the Latin American context, from what I've heard here, from talking to people. For example, the Center Party is a very clear social liberal party that focus a lot on, liberalization of the economic markets that's free, but still liberal in the value sense as well, very progressive party and stuff like that. We have the Liberals, which is very, very similar actually to the Center Party in the sense that we are also very progressive. It is economically free, very free party, but also would be defined as social liberal, I think. And then we have the Moderates, which is the M there, which is a party that themselves, they call themselves liberal conservative. I think in the context of the rest of the world, they would just be liberals and not liberal conservative. But in the Swedish context, they're called liberal conservative. And they're a party that's also focus a lot on maybe even more than the other parties on the free market and having a free market. And also they have some more conservative policies than the Center Party and the Liberal Party in terms of values, but still I would say on a global scale, they are a very progressive party actually. And then we have the Christian Democrats, which is a party that's they are conservative, like value-based conservative. I think in a global context, they might be like more moderate when it comes to like their values, but in Swedish context, they're conservative. But when it comes to the economic scale of things, they are also very pro, free market, very, liberal in the economic scale and the economic presence of things. So there are actually 4 parties that can be considered liberal in Sweden. And if you think about that, you can think of like kind of where the economic scale, like the political scales of Sweden actually are. It is a very liberal country in its sense, because I'll show you later on the other parties that exist too. But you can pass. I just wanted to clarify, no, you can go back. Yes, I just wanted to clarify here that like in a Swedish context, the other 2 parties would not be called liberal. These are the parties that would be called liberal, the Center Party and the Liberals, just because in Sweden, and liberals cannot be taken just in an economic sense. It's like you have to be progressive to be called a liberal party. And these are the progressive parties, but yes, in a global sense, all 4 of those parties will be considered liberal parties. So the political landscape of Sweden. You can use kind of different ways to show kind of where political party stands. You can use kind of the triangle where you have conservatism on the top, socialism on the on the right, my right there, and then liberalism on the far bottom. And there you see kind of how in the Swedish sense you would kind of classify the Liberal Party and like the triangle. I would say it's very like Swedish context. Like you see the conservatism up there, and there's not really truly conservative parties in Sweden. And then a lot of parties are drifting more towards the liberal scale. Also, if you're using the Galtan, how do you say this in English? The square, the Galtan square, which I think Michel also used. It's very interesting actually to see the differences, because if you remember with what Michel showed, everything was like in the top right corner, right? Like in the top right in the square. But in Sweden, it's very, very different. You have the Left Party, which is the former Communist Party. That is very, very socialist, of course. You have the Green Party, also in that sense, in the like the socialist square. The Social Democrats, which is the party that's actually ruled Sweden for 50 years. And 50 consecutive years from the year Sweden got democracy, and then lost like 2 elections, and then ruled again, lost like 1 election, and then is ruling again now. So you see like Sweden has been very much controlled by the Social Democratic Party, who had like their own majority for a very, very long time. And they can be considered more to the left, but still, I would say definitely not like a socialist party. But the other parties that I was showing you, the 4 kind of liberal parties are, on the right side of things, and the Center Party and the Liberals are more like down in terms of values, like less conservative. But you have the other parties that are more conservative, but also are on the right. So the political landscape of Sweden is very, very special. As you can see, it's very, very different from a lot of other European countries that might look more like Germany, which like Michel showed, whereas Sweden, due to our history of not, being a very left kind of country, historically has a very different landscape. But this is the view kind of so you can know what the political landscape of Sweden looks like. So next one. Just so you can see kind of where the coalitions are, we're starting to talk about the 2028 elections. The thing is, the difference from the presentation before is that we have not had an election since the pandemic. Our last election was in 2018. Our next election is this year. So we have not had like any effect of the pandemic during our elections, which is good to keep in mind as well. Right now, we have a social democratic government that was initially the Social Democrats and the Green Party together, but the Green Party left the government this summer. And initially, the government by the Greens and the Social Democrats was supported by the Liberals, the Center Party, and the Left Party. But then later on, when the Green Party also left, the Liberals left supporting the government, and now it's a solely social democratic government supported by the Green Party, the Center Party, and the Left Party. So you see, like, the coalitions are also kind of different. And if you look at the elections in 2014, like before this, or even further back, it was all the parties that was, can you go back? All the parties that was on the right, except for the Sweden Democrats, were in one coalition, but that coalition broke. So it's been a very like a whirlwind when it comes to the coalitions that have existed in Sweden. They've been gone front to back, like it's a very turbulent time. And the reason it's a very turbulent time is because before it was only the Social Democrats that had majority. So it's basically everyone against the Social Democrats because they had majority. But now Sweden is going to a time where we actually have to make coalitions in a very different way. The Social Democrats has to cooperate, and the other parties has to, cooperate over like different lines that exist here. So it's been a very, very different landscape, especially with the rise of the Sweden Democrats, which is like a far-right party, like a far-right populist party that kind of changed the dimensions of the political landscape. So right now we're kind of in a very weird time in Swedish politics when it comes to coalition building. You can go forward. So let's talk at the actual like election results. If you look at this, first, if you look at the general results, you see that the Center Party and the Liberal Party are very similar parties. Basically, like the differences are very small. If I would explain it to you, it would be like, well, it doesn't matter, like these differences. So if you put the Center Party and the Liberal Party are the parties that are considered liberals, put the results together and you see what like the support of liberalism is in Sweden in terms of like political party politics. So you see that 8.6% and 5.4% or 5.5%. And the Center Party and the Liberal Party kind of switches, but it's usually the same like together. But we switch who is like the most popular at the time. And then you have, the moderates, which can be considered, like I said, also Liberal Party has 19% or 19.8, so almost 20%. And then the Christian Democrats, KD is short for, has 6.3%. So if we're looking at all the parties I said can be considered liberals and put them together, it is a very, very good result actually for liberalism in Sweden, right? But then you see also the far-right party in Sweden, the Sweden Democrats have 17.5%, which is a lot. But remember what I told you, that we never had an election during the pandemic. And what was the biggest kind of thing that was before, if you think pre-2020, which is kind of hard to kind of think, but the biggest thing, at least in Europe then, was the migration crisis, 2015. This was in 2018. And they are like a far-right party, very anti-migration. If you remember 2015, the big migration crisis, Sweden was one of the countries that took the most immigrants per capita in the whole of EU. So that really, let's say, tainted the elections in 2018 because it was only like 3 years after that was one of the biggest things that was in everyone's mind. What happened in 2015 with the whole like kind of migration crisis from Syria and all of these countries that came to Sweden. So that is one of the reasons why Sweden Democrats are so big here. It's hard to say what's going to happen, in that context. Whereas actually the Liberal Party, the Liberals, us, and the Center Party were kind of small. Like the Liberals have been like up to 12%, but we were actually the party that was the most like pro-migration at the time. We were like open borders type party, and it did not work for us. But that is also a context you need to like keep in mind. And if you see FI, that is small, is the Feminist Party of Sweden. And that party actually in the elections before with the Me Too movement, if you remember, and everything, they were actually they became a pretty big party and got some seats in some like local municipalities and stuff. But it's actually pretty cool that Sweden has a feminist party that's actually in the debates, like relevant, that's relevant, and it's called the Feminist Party. And then since we're talking about youth, it's interesting actually to compare the results on the left for you guys. On the left is the youth results, and as you can see, if you compare the general result and the youth result, it's not really that different. And if I would compare like the youth result and like older people result, like specifically, it's not like the dimensions are not really that big of a difference that you can say like the youth votes like this, draw that conclusion actually, which is interesting because in other countries it's very, very like specific by like age group a lot, but in Sweden it's not really that way as much actually in terms of the voting. It's pretty similar. You see the left party is a tiny bit bigger, and also the center party, but then you see the liberals also a little smaller, so you can't really draw those big, huge conclusions actually. Although the left party slightly more popular with the young people, the Socialist Party actually. And I think if you go to the next slide, a lot of the differences are actually in gender, which is, wouldn't really think so. But if you look at this, like this is women on the right between 18 to 29, men between 18 to 29, and you compare this, it is a huge difference, which is actually very interesting. You see this Sweden Democrats, the far right, very like populist party is very, very big with men, whereas the left party, like the Socialist Party, is very, very big with women. If you can draw some type of conclusion like that. So you see there's a huge difference between gender, how gender votes in Sweden, which you wouldn't really, like you wouldn't really expect that. But that is like, when we're analyzing different elections results in Sweden, it's often like a lot of talk about gender because there's a huge gender difference. And I think partly is due to the issues that are brought up by kind of the left, which are very popular in women, are very like soft issues in brackets, you know. It's like the welfare system, which is mostly women work in the welfare system and talking about that, and then talking about like being humanitarian in terms of taking in refugees and stuff like that, which women are more pro than men are, whereas like the moderates and the Sweden Democrats talk about more harsh issues. In practice again, like for example, defense, which men are more pro in general in Sweden, and like having a great defense system, whereas women are more generally considered more pacifist and more like that. The neutrality of Sweden is very important to women, so that also creates a big difference in how men and women vote. But as you can see, like the gender is more significant difference than age. Which is something that's kind of interesting in the context of Sweden, actually, I would say. So yeah, and next slide. I just like identified some trends that I think are important to keep in mind when it comes to the voter behavior and trends in politics in Sweden, that I'm sort of like as a politician myself. So I would say a reason to why the political landscape looks as it does right now, where the liberals are becoming smaller, the socialists are becoming bigger, and the far right is becoming, like the far right populists are becoming bigger. So the two populists, like the left populists and the far right populists, are becoming bigger, and the parties in the middle are becoming smaller. The liberals that are considered more liberal in Sweden, and the Social Democrats that are more also more to the center of politics are becoming smaller. The populist part and the people on the ends of the political scale are becoming bigger. And the reason I think this is that there's some things, like the general things. I'm not talking about the general trends, like in Europe, you know, there are general trends about populism, like internationally, and all those things. You probably already studied this if you're like international relations majors, like the general trends of how the political landscape is changing with populism and all of that. That's not really what I'm talking about. I'm just talking specific to Sweden, some of the trends. And I would say that politics has kind of become more kind of inward-looking and short-sighted, whereas Sweden before was a very like a long-term perspective kind of country, where there was obvious majorities, obvious like clear distinctions, lines between the parties. That has been the tradition in Sweden, but it's not really anymore. There's also the credibility problem, because Sweden has always, put itself on a high pedestal when it comes to our welfare system. I think we're the best in the world when it comes to how our state is run. But when you start to see kind of brackets of it, especially when we took in a lot of immigrants and saw that it's not really as equal anymore and all of these things, it kind of becomes a credibility problem, because if you're going to have these high taxes, which I as a liberal in general think we shouldn't have, but if you're going to have it, you have to have something to show for it. But if you're having these high taxes and you're not even having that great welfare system anymore, then there is a huge credibility problem, and people are going to look for the parties that have the easy answers, the far left and the far right. And it kind of undermines the confidence in politics, undermines the confidence in the future, which makes people look for easy answers. Then you have the stability problems, the fact that, before we had a very stable sense of politics. You knew that was either the Social Democrats that's going to rule of their own, or a coalition of all the liberal parties. Those were the two, either one of these are going to rule. But now it's not anymore. We have the Sweden Democrats, we have the far left party that's becoming a lot bigger as well. So it's not really stable anymore, which makes also usually people look for easy answers, right? And then we have the competitive challenges, where Sweden is if we're comparing ourselves to other countries are going ahead of us in a lot of different ways, in a way that wasn't before. Before we were, pride ourselves of having the best welfare system, having the best of a lot of different things, education, and having equality, the equality index, and all of these things. We don't really have that anymore in the same sense, which also creates issues. And then the cohesion problems, for example, when we take in a lot of refugees, creates integration problems, segregation, and then Sweden is becoming more and more polarized, which a lot of other countries are becoming due to geographical and demographical issues as well. We have a very aging population. We're taking in a lot of immigrants. Everything is changing. We see the trend of things changing in Sweden, which makes people also look for easy answer parties. I would say far left, far right. So these are voter behavior and trends that I can identify that can explain kind of what is happening in Sweden right now politically. So these are just some pointers. And then the next one, this is maybe a little fetching out from my side. I have to, because I'm a politician, I have to say what I think, in a more general sense. I think for Sweden, liberals really need to set a direction for where we want to head at, because right now the liberalism in Sweden is very split. Is no really clear idea, do we want to focus on the economic liberalism? Do we want to focus on, what do we want to focus on? What is our identity? And here I think Swedish liberalism can learn a lot from the FDP and what FDP did, because we haven't done that work. And I think we might be heading in the same direction, where we have to, lose and head out of the parliament in order to do that work. Because I think we need that, of reinventing ourselves and stuff like that. And we need to kind of navigate the new political landscape and still appear as a stable choice, which we're not really right now. People don't really know where to place, at least the Liberals and the Center Party on the political map, which makes it harder for them to vote for us. Also, we need to kind of focus on the economic side of things. Liberals, unfortunately, in Sweden for a very long time has just accepted the fact that we have very high taxes, a lot of these restrictions on our freedoms. We kind of accepted that because that's been the status quo for such a long time. But I think the liberals in Sweden really need to take that fight more about opening up our society and more freedom, and then our economic market even more. Although we've done a lot of great strides, we've been kind of chilling for a while, but we need to stop doing that. And also more focus on solving the more urgent social problems that we have, like the integration, and the migration issues, and equality issues, in the sense of children having the same type of educational promises and stuff like that. We need to focus on these urgent social problems instead of all this regulation that we are currently having. And I think we need to encourage like a very constructive political dialogue in Sweden, because it's changed from what was usually a very consensus type of politics in Sweden for a very, very long time to a very harsh climate. And I don't think that works with Swedish voters. Not saying we need to go back to like the consensus type of politics that Sweden like traditionally has had like completely, but like I don't think it's working this harsh type of climate where we're trying to emulate kind of like the American politics of ways. Doesn't really work in Sweden that well. So I would say like maybe heading back more towards consensus type of dialogue that Sweden has been very known for, and I think has been very, very good for a very long time. So more heading in that direction. So that was a very quick summary of Swedish politics. But if you have any questions, feel free to ask if I want me to elaborate on some certain points. Thank you.
Thanks to you, Amanda, for that very engaging and interesting presentation. Muchas gracias a Amanda por esta presentación, y para hacer un breve resumen, Amanda en primer lugar comienza negando tajantemente que Suecia sea un paraíso socialista y destina la primera parte de su presentación a decir que básicamente es un país capitalista con un alto grado de redistribución impositiva, con una liberalización igualmente importante y un mercado económico muy dinámico, y da el ejemplo del índice de libertad económica, en el cual Suecia tiene el puesto 21, y para dar un ejemplo ella dice que Estados Unidos está en el puesto 20, para justificar cuán libre es la economía sueca. Después se indaga más en profundidad en lo que es el sistema de partidos políticos sueco y las diferencias que ella enfatiza muy interesantes con respecto al sistema alemán que presentaba Michele previamente. Y dice que hay 4 partidos que se podrían identificar como liberales: el partido de centro, el partido liberal al que ella propiamente pertenece como funcionaria electa, el partido de los moderados y el partido demócrata cristiano. Todos esos 4 partidos, ella dice, pueden ser en sentido estricto definidos como liberales, si bien dice en Suecia particularmente solo el partido de centro y el partido liberal lo son. Después nos mostró unos gráficos triangular y rectangular, en el cual ella indicaba que no hay verdaderos partidos conservadores en Suecia, lo cual dice hace que sea un sistema político muy diferente al del resto de la Unión Europea. Y también otra cosa que ha sido muy particular del sistema sueco recientemente es que no ha habido elecciones luego del año 2018 por la situación de la pandemia causada por el COVID-19. Entonces, desde 2018 a la fecha, las mismas fuerzas políticas en el Parlamento han configurado diferentes tipos de gobiernos en diferentes coaliciones, y obviamente ella comentaba que el criterio con el cual esos partidos han sido consagrados al Parlamento en 2018 no reflejan los temas que son vigentes en la actualidad. Ya decía, en el 2015, por ejemplo, en adelante, el principal tema era el influjo migratorio de Asia Central y Medio Oriente hacia Europa, y en particular Suecia, que ha tenido una gran recepción y acogida en términos de población general a los refugiados. También destacaba el rol preponderante que tuvo el Partido Socialdemócrata en Suecia desde la recuperación democrática en el país. En adelante ha gobernado por, decía, más de 50 años seguidos, luego ha dejado, ha vuelto a estar en coaliciones y demás, pero realmente marca la preponderancia de este partido en la vida política de este país, también como un punto diferenciador con los otros países de la región. Analizó también Amanda el rol del voto joven en Suecia, y dice que las mujeres jóvenes entre 18 y 29 años en Suecia tienden a votar hacia los partidos de izquierda mayoritariamente, que están asociadas con la llama cuestiones blandas, entre comillas obviamente, por estereotipo más que otra cosa, asociadas con el estado de bienestar, con los refugiados, etc. Mientras que los hombres jóvenes tienden a favorecer también a partidos populistas, en algunos casos también de extrema derecha, que están más asociados a cuestiones de vuelta, falsas comillas duras, como la defensa y la seguridad. Finalmente, la exposición termina con una proyección sobre el escenario político actual. Ella ve que los populismos, tanto de extrema izquierda como de derecha, están creciendo, mientras que los partidos moderados, incluyendo el Partido Liberal al que ella representa, están perdiendo el caudal electoral, y esto lo aduce a que los populismos tienen respuestas fáciles para cuestiones difíciles. el crecimiento populista entonces lleva a la polarización del sistema político sueco y de la sociedad sueca. Ella lo ve como algo negativo porque en general la política en Suecia se regulaba por la búsqueda del consenso y que en los últimos años se ha vuelto muy confrontativa. Y ella sugiere no regresar igualmente al modelo tal como estaba previo a esta confrontación, pero tratar de moderar un poco la dinámica del sistema político sueco. También menciona que el estado de bienestar actualmente no es tan equitativo como Suecia lo comenta, y eso genera un problema de credibilidad en el país, así como el problema de la estabilidad política que se estaría perdiendo. Así que muchas gracias, Amanda, por la presentación, y ahora sí, estamos abiertos a todas las preguntas que deseen hacer, tanto los asistentes de la sala como los asistentes vía Zoom. Los escuchamos. Sí, Santiago.
Super interesting, the exposition in general. And the question that surged is, up to what point do you believe, and please correct me if I'm stating something that is not right, do you believe that the fact that the quarantine and all the measures that were taken from the pandemic were somehow softer or less restrictive in Sweden than they were in other countries of Europe, such as, or well, here in Argentina it was quite restrictive, everything. So what do you think that actually contributes to the fact that, well, maybe liberalism is not the first option for voters? And do you think that if maybe the context was different and you actually had a government that was a little bit more restrictive, that would have contributed towards a surge of liberalism?
It's a very interesting question. And it's like, you get, like, there's a very long answer to this and a short answer to this, but I would say, first of all, the government that handled the COVID pandemic was a Green and Social Democratic government, and they were the ones that, you know, that led the people. So it was not like, which is very interesting because in a lot of countries, it's been like the opposite. Like it's been the very, like the right has been like very, like maybe anti restrictions. But in Sweden, actually, I was talking about the consensus politics. There was actually a clear consensus on the decision. It was not something that was divided on political lines. And if you look at like the people and like they polled of like Swedish people think of the COVID response, it's been very, very positive, like overwhelmingly positive to not having restrictions and having no lockdown and all of these things. And that's on the left and on the right. So it's been like a kind of clear consensus actually in Sweden to do it this way. And people are very happy that we did it that way, like in general. And all the political parties basically had kind of similar views on it and like worked together on it and decided that this is the way we want to do it. But that's kind of like a short answer, but like to go a step further, I think the reason we kind of did this way is because Sweden has like had a very, very long tradition of like trusting experts on things and letting experts like handle things and not stepping in as politicians. So for example, we have something called like, how do you say in English, like myndighetsstyre. It's like not like government, not government rules, like a very bad translation of it, but like the different branches of, if you say, so for example, say you have a government that is ruling, for example, the healthcare, and then you have like a branch of it that's like run by like a director of that branch. The minister in that cannot step in and tell the expert or like tell like the director what to do in any sense, like it's forbidden. All they can do is like send like the regular general notes of what they want, but it's very, very separated, the like the ministry and like the politics of it all and actual running of it all. And when it comes to pandemics, Sweden had a strategy, which I think a lot of countries also had when it comes to these things, that like when this happens, when pandemics happens, this is how we deal with it. But then the whole world kind of went crazy and everyone started like competing on who could have the like most tough restrictions and lockdowns. And that was from politicians and not from like the actual, you know, like the experts in all of these things. That came from a lot of politicians, like a lot of the measures and stuff, I would say. So like we just let the head of our department that deals with pandemics, like just an ordinary boss of like pandemic situations, like not a politician at all, just decide on what's the best way to do it. And they had their researchers and everything, and they decided like this is the best way. And the politicians were like, okay, you know? And while the other countries were like, oh, like competing against each other, like on how restrictions, it became a political issue. Sweden was shamed. A lot of countries like the UK changed when they were shamed, although their experts also said the same things. And a lot of experts all around the world said the same thing, but you know, it became this political contest. Whereas Sweden were like, we're not gonna participate in that. We're gonna follow what our experts say. And I have to, like, I'm Swedish, I can't like say, but I think we were right, you know, if you look at it. Like, yeah, so I think that's why we did it in that way. And if anything, if it's gonna affect elections this year, I think actually positively to the government that may like let them do that, you know, because the Social Democrats are actually pretty strong right now, and they're the government now, and people are very happy with how things were, and no party really objected, really. So it's just consensus, you know. So it's a very good question, but yeah. So, but there's no other answer than like everyone's happy with it, and we just follow the experts, you know.
Thank you very much. The Argentinian president had the say of telling Sweden that they were doing things wrong.
Yeah.
La pregunta de Santiago era sobre cómo fue adoptada las restricciones en Suecia de cara a la pandemia de COVID-19, y Amanda comentaba que a diferencia de otros países no hubo polarización en Suecia sobre estas medidas. El gobierno de coalición del Partido Verde y Socialdemócrata resolvió esto, pero fue una manera muy consensuada con las otras fuerzas políticas, y sobre todo, dice, en Suecia hay una gran cultura de confiar en los expertos, y si los expertos lo dicen, el resto de la sociedad lo sigue, lo acata. Y dice que esto es lo que pasó en su país, que si bien fue eventualmente muy criticado, para ella los expertos tuvieron razón en el largo plazo, y denotan las diferencias que existen entre Suecia, donde no hubo esta polarización o este debate sobre el tema de las restricciones, a diferencia de otros países en Europa en que sí existieron este tipo de controversias. Voy a ir al chat, ahora voy, gracias. Sonia, muchas gracias por tu pregunta. Voy a traducírsela a los expositores. So we have a question for you from the chat. Sonia asked you if you know how youth would see the educational prospects, or would they see the intention, the vote intention. She would like to know the methodology by which you made the studies you showed on your presentations. How did you establish relationships between their political preferences and their educational background?
Oh, so she's wondering if there is a link between the educational background by the youth and how they vote. Mm-hmm. I would say there's like a general relation between like not only the youth, but like in general how people vote and their educational background. In Sweden is probably the same in a lot of countries. For example, people who have like a higher educational background have been found to vote more for my party, Liberals, for example, and vote like for the actual Liberal parties in Sweden, whereas people with like a less educational background are found to vote more for the Sweden Democrats and the Social Democratic Party. So there are some links with the voting behavior with educational background in general, and I think this also reflects in the youth. Where like the liberal parties, like the 4 liberal parties I show you, our voters are usually more highly educated in general and higher income in general, whereas like the Social Democrats and the Sweden Democrats, like the far right party, usually have a lower educational level on their voters.
Thank you. Entonces, Amanda, lo que dice es que hay una ligera correlación, que los votantes jóvenes con menos educación tienden a votar hacia la izquierda, y en particular el Partido Socialdemócrata, y los votantes con más nivel educativo y mayores ingresos tienden a votar mayoritariamente a estos 4 partidos liberales que Amanda mencionaba en su intervención. Sí.
Yes, well, nice presentation. I would like to ask you if you can go deep this separation that the Swedish state have between politicians and administration, because here everything is mixed.
Oh, wow.
You
Yeah.
can explain
Sure.
that?
It's kind of complicated thing, but I think Sweden is very like extreme in one sense on this, because we have like an absolute forbidness for example, ministers to step in and tell, for example, the general director of the administrative part of what they're like the ministers is governing, to tell them what to do. So basically the ministry and the politicians just write like general stances on like things and how things should be done. Of course, we can make laws as politicians, we can tell generally what they should do, you can have conversations with them, but it's very separated. The application of something and the rules of it. So we as politicians make the rules of it and how it should be done, what results we want, how we want them to do it, whereas they're supposed to implement it, but we're not supposed to tell them how to like, we can tell them in general how to implement it, but when they're doing like specific individual things based on our rules, based on how we told them to implement things, we cannot interfere as politicians. So it's very strictly regulated, the separation of this. And if a minister actually do this, they can then be brought like by the, usually like the parliament can then bring them up to have a non-confidence vote on them. So it's very, very serious. And I think this kind of tradition had an effect in our COVID response, because we let the Anders Timell is his name, who runs the People's Health. My English is going by. The People's Health kind of not the department. This department, I guess, is like the political part, but like the actual administration of it, like the myndighet.
I don't know Swedish, but branch.
Yeah, but it's basically let me check here. Like the agency.
Yes.
Yeah, that's the agency that runs like the agency. The People's House agency, like he's like a government official, like he's not an elected politician. He's like just like a expert that's hired, and he runs it. And the social department, like the politicals, told them like, this is what we want. We agreed on a certain strategy when it comes to pandemics that we decided as like the politicians decided all of this. But then when a pandemic comes, it's his job to implement the strategies that we decided. And he did that. And that's why we just follow it, because we're not supposed to step in and tell them how we want. Of course, there was some things, that we still as politicians, still did. But, and my party and all the parties, but still like the main sense was like, follow the recommendations of that agency. And we're not making laws about it, like follow the directions of the agency. Although there were some things done, of course, but that was the general consensus.
That's awesome.
Gracias, Amanda, por la respuesta. La pregunta buscaba indagar sobre cómo se da en Suecia la división entre política y administración. Y Amanda comentaba que esto está extremadamente regulado. En Suecia está prohibido que ambas mezclen. Generalmente los políticos básicamente hacen las leyes y pueden indicar a grosso modo cómo les gustaría que se implementen ciertas medidas, pero tienen que estar completamente alejados de la administración per se, que esto se hace a partir de agencias gubernamentales específicas. Y en el caso de que un político se vea acusado de estar excesivamente involucrado en la administración, puede incluso el Parlamento hacer un voto de confianza negativo en su investidura ministerial. Ignacio, tenés la mano levantada, no sé si es una nueva pregunta o quedó de antes.
No, sí, quería hacer otra pregunta.
Perfecto, te escuchamos.
Okay, I wanted to ask about the thing that you said, that to maybe make a relationship between the weakness of the liberals in general. You said there were 4 liberal parties, still very, very liberal, but in general there are like 4 liberal parties. Could it be that the weakness of liberalism in Sweden, it could be related with having so much political parties for quite weak political parties instead of having one very strong. For example, I'm reading it with perhaps what happened in Spain during the pandemic in 2021. There were like 3 right-wing parties, and there were like 2 more liberal ones, and those 2 liberals were quite weak. Then one of those parties had like a scandal, and the other ate all the voters, and the other one is the one that got the voters from the weaker one is now the stronger party of Spain. Could it be like doing something like that in Sweden, make the liberalism stronger? I don't know if you got my question.
Yes, so your question is basically like, do I see a benefit if we would like merge the parties basically in order to create like a stronger party?
Yes, yeah. Politically speaking.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for the question. I think it's a very good question. The thing is in Sweden is the fact that, you know, when you kind of have a society that is already pretty liberal, where people kind of agree on a lot of like liberal things, the kind of conflict places becomes different. So although, you know, there's 4 parties, like in a global sense, you would consider liberal, in Sweden, everything is shifted. So there's still like, my party would never see itself becoming close to the Christian Democrats. Although other people see this party as liberal, the conflict of like interest conflicts becomes so big because different than there would be here, where things like you're fighting for like just to have like big, like some freedoms, whereas in Sweden, like the conflict where we have the conflict is just too different for them to merge. So, for example, the Christian Democrats, as I said, has conservative values in a Swedish sense, maybe not here, but in Swedish sense, like they would consider have conservative values, something that the liberals and center parties very, very much against, and is very, very important for us. And then, for example, the moderates have some conservative values, also very, very hard for the liberals and the center party to accept. Just so these like things becomes more and more important the further you come in liberalizing your society. And I would say Sweden has come pretty far in liberalizing our society. So just the conflicts becomes too different for us to be able to merge. I would say center party and liberal party, yes, it would make sense actually, because for us, we kind of like, one is bigger and the other is smaller all the time. And we're like fighting for the same voters and stuff. It's just that with our parties, it's just become a way where it's like, actually, I would for them to merge, but you're not allowed to say that. I can say that here, I'm in Argentina, but in Sweden, I would be, you know, kicked out. But it's just like, we fought against each other for so long in terms of politics. It just wouldn't work in our party cultures and stuff like that. Silly things, I would say, actually. But that just wouldn't work. But it would work politically, I would say, Center Party and the Liberal Party. But the other 2 parties, no, it wouldn't work just because values is such a big part of the Swedish political landscape due to how far we've come with liberalizing everything else, you know? So we look at those things very specifically as well now. So that wouldn't work. But Center Party, Liberal Party, yeah, I think there's a lot of things in what you're saying that would actually benefit us by merging those 2 parties.
Bien, la pregunta de Ignacio era si no convenía a nivel electoral en Suecia fusionar los partidos liberales para tener más votos, más caudal político. Y lo que comenta Amanda es que si bien afuera del país esto parece algo posible y algo favorable, a nivel interno en el país las diferencias son grandes conflictos de intereses, si bien afuera pueden parecer sutiles, y esto hace que sea imposible conciliarlos, si bien obviamente a nivel electoral sería ideal para tener un mayor porcentaje de votos y de representantes electos y demás, a nivel político lamentablemente lo ve como imposible de realizar en su país. Con esto damos por cerrado entonces el espacio de las preguntas. Les agradecemos mucho a ustedes por haberse conectado y a nuestros expositores. No sé si el doctor Richter quiere decir unas palabras. Bien, invitamos al doctor Richter, director de la Fundación Cátedra Naumann en Argentina. Le doy unas palabras. Bienvenido.
Muchas gracias. Bueno, la cámara está allá, ¿verdad?
Sí,
Muy bien. Entonces, muchas gracias. Solamente un minuto. Bueno, quiero agradecer a ustedes, a los participantes en la pantalla, en la conferencia de Zoom, aquí a los participantes aquí en la sala. Yo quiero agradecer lógicamente a los expositores. Muchas gracias a los representantes de IFLRY. Fue muy interesante escuchar los casos de Suecia, muy interesante, y lógicamente de Alemania. Muchas gracias a ustedes por sus presentaciones. Muchas gracias a Nadia del equipo Naumann y a Nadia que abrió este evento. Lo siento mucho que no pude abrirlo. Entonces, muchas gracias, como siempre, a nuestros amigos y partners de la UCEMA, un placer. Y eso, que estoy seguro que Nadia lo mencionó, eso es la primera vez hace 2 años, la primera vez después de del pico de la pandemia que estamos aquí. Es una ocasión muy especial, porque esta serie, esta Cátedra Naumann fue establecido antes de la pandemia, pero empezamos durante la pandemia, en las salas de Zoom, y esa es la primera vez que lo hacemos, entonces en un formato híbrido. Gran placer, muchas gracias de vuelta y nos vemos muy pronto. Nos vemos en abril, tenemos otros invitados, otros planes para los meses de abril y de mayo, siempre sobre cuestiones de relaciones exteriores. Muchas gracias.
Gracias a todos, muy buenas tardes y nos esperamos en las futuras actividades de la Cátedra Naumann en la Universidad de Alemania. Buenas tardes, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.